I was sorting through some old boxes in the spare bedroom of our row house in Pittsburgh one rainy afternoon last November when I found it. Tucked behind a stack of faded photo albums and old utility bills was a worn leather journal with my husband's handwriting on the cover. It was dated from right after we moved here from Ohio 3 years ago. I almost closed the box again because it felt wrong to read something private, but a line on the first page I could see made me stop. I sat down on the floor with the journal in my lap and started turning pages. The entries were short at first, just notes about work projects he and his coworker Troy were handling together. Then one entry stopped me cold. It read, "Heather keeps pushing to lead the client calls. She doesn't see how emotional she gets when the numbers get tight." Troy and I agreed we need to shut that down at the next meeting. Make it clear she's support only so the clients don't get confused about who's really running things. My hands started shaking. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining the words. Another entry a few pages later said they planned to let her handle the small stuff and take the credit on the bigger contracts so she doesn't get ideas about expanding her role. I closed the journal and just sat there on the hardwood floor while the rain tapped against the window. My chest felt tight, like someone had pulled the air out of the room. For years, I had told myself the little corrections in meetings and the way he always jumped in when I was talking to clients were just his way of being thorough. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to turn small disagreements into big fights. I thought that was what marriage asked of you sometimes. Reading those pages made me realize he and Troy had been building a story about me behind my back for a long time. If you've ever stayed quiet in your own home because speaking up felt like it would make everything fall apart, you probably understand the knot that formed in my stomach right then. I kept telling myself maybe I was reading too much into it, that people vent in journals, and it doesn't mean anything. But the words were too specific. They had names of clients we had worked with. They had dates that lined up with meetings where I had felt small afterward. I put the journal back in the box and pushed it under some old blankets so it wouldn't be obvious I had moved anything. Then I went downstairs and tried to act normal. When my husband came home from work that evening, he kissed me on the cheek, like always, and asked what was for dinner. I wanted to ask him about the things I had read, but the words felt too big in my throat. Instead, I asked how his day had gone and whether Troy had been helpful on the new proposal. He shrugged and said Troy was solid and that the two of them had everything under control. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "You don't need to sit in on every call anymore. It's better if you focus on the back-end stuff you're good at." Troy and I can handle the face-to-face. The way he said it was so casual, like he was doing me a favor. I felt that same cold drop in my stomach I had felt on the floor upstairs. I nodded and changed the subject because I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Later that night after he fell asleep, I lay awake, listening to the quiet of the house. I kept replaying the journal entries in my head and wondering how many times I had swallowed my own voice to keep things smooth. Staying quiet had let them keep writing that story about me. It had let the cycle continue. I didn't have a plan yet. I just knew I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I had seen. The next morning, I called my friend Rowan while my husband was in the shower. Rowan and I had known each other since college, and she was the only person I trusted with the messy parts of my life. I told her I had found something that made me question everything about how my husband and his coworker treated me at work. She didn't rush me or tell me I was overreacting. She just said, "Whatever you decide to do next, I've got your back." Hearing her say that out loud made my eyes sting. I hadn't realized how alone I had been feeling until someone said they were still on my side. I didn't tell Rowan every detail that first call. I was still trying to make sense of it myself. But talking to her gave me enough steadiness to get through the day without falling apart in front of my husband. That afternoon, I went for a short walk around the block to clear my head. Our neighbor, Mrs. Doris Scott, was out front raking leaves, even though it was almost winter. She waved and asked if everything was all right. I told her I was fine, Just needed some air. She looked at me for a second longer than usual and said, "You know where I am if you need to talk. Sometimes the walls in these old houses hear more than we think." I thanked her and kept walking, but her words stayed with me. That evening, my husband mentioned a client dinner coming up in a couple of weeks. He said it would be him, Troy, and one of the bigger accounts we had been courting. He didn't invite me. When I asked if I should come along to handle the financial side, he said, "Troy and I have the presentation covered. You can send over the updated spreadsheets if you want, but we don't need you there for the discussion." The way he said, we made it clear who was in the room and who wasn't. I felt the familiar sting of being pushed to the edge of my own work, but this time I didn't argue. I just nodded and went upstairs early. I pulled the journal out again after he went to bed. There was another entry from a few months later that described exactly the kind of moment I had just lived through. He had written that if I ever pushed back too hard, Troy would back him up in front of the clients, so it would look like I was the difficult one. Reading that made something shift inside me. It wasn't just venting anymore. Oh, it was a plan they had carried out more than once. I sat on the edge of the bed with the journal in my hands and let myself feel how much it hurt. Not just the betrayal, but the realization that I had helped it happen by staying quiet every single time it mattered. The cycle had kept going because I had chosen peace over truth over and over. I didn't know what I was going to do about any of it yet. I only knew I couldn't keep choosing silence. The days after I found the journal blurred together in a strange mix of normal routines and this heavy, quiet dread I couldn't shake. I went to work, made dinner, answered my husband's questions about my day, but every time he mentioned his coworker Troy or the upcoming client dinner, I felt that same cold pull in my chest. I kept the journal hidden in a drawer in the spare room and only took it out late at night when he was asleep. Reading the entries again didn't make them hurt less. If anything, seeing the dates and the specific ways they planned to correct me in front of people made the hurt settle deeper, like it was becoming part of me. I called my friend Rowan again 2 days later. This time I told her more. I read her one of the shorter entries over the phone, my voice low so it wouldn't carry through the house. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Heather, that's not venting. That's them deciding who you get to be at work." Hearing her name it out loud made my eyes burn. I had been trying so hard to tell myself it was just my husband blowing off steam with a colleague. Rowan's words took that excuse away. She asked if I was going to say something to him. I told her I didn't know yet. The thought of opening that conversation felt like standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. That same afternoon, our neighbor, Mrs. Doris Scott, knocked on the door with a container of soup she said she had made too much of. She stood on the porch in her heavy cardigan and asked how I was doing in that gentle way older neighbors sometimes do. I thanked her for the soup and said I was fine. She didn't leave right away. Instead, she looked past me into the house for a second, then lowered her voice and said I was out walking the dog the other evening and saw your husband and that coworker of his standing by the car talking. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard your name. They were laughing about how you get worked up over details and how they were going to keep you from taking over the presentation at that dinner. She paused like she was deciding whether to say the rest. It didn't sound like they were joking. I felt my face go hot and then cold at the same time. I thanked her again, took the soup, and closed the door before she could see how much her words had landed. I stood in the kitchen with the container in my hands and let the shaking start. Mrs. Doris Scott had witnessed part of the plan without even meaning to. She had seen the two of them standing there, comfortable enough to talk about sidelining me in public. The neighbor who waved at us every morning had just handed me proof that this wasn't only in my head or in an old journal. I didn't tell my husband about the conversation with Mrs. Doris Scott. Instead, I went upstairs and wrote down exactly what she had said, the date, the time, everything I could remember. It felt strange to be documenting my own life like evidence, but I couldn't trust my memory anymore. Every time I had stayed quiet before the story they told about me had grown. I was starting to understand that silence hadn't protected me. It had only given them more room to decide who I was allowed to be. The client dinner was now less than 2 weeks away. My husband brought it up again over breakfast one morning, casual like always. He said Troy had some good ideas for how to structure the pitch and that they were going to keep it tight so the clients wouldn't get overwhelmed with too many voices. He didn't look at me when he said it. I asked if there was still time for me to review the final numbers before they presented. He gave a small shrug and said, "Troy and I already locked those in. You can send your notes if you want, but we've got it." We landed the same way it always did now, like a door closing. Later that day, I found myself standing in front of the closet, staring at the dress I usually wore to client things. I didn't pull it out. I just stood there, thinking about what it would feel like to walk into that dinner and have them treat me like an afterthought in front of people whose respect I had worked for. The thought made my throat tight. I had spent years being the one who smoothed things over, who let the corrections slide, who told myself it was easier to be smaller than to fight. That choice had kept the cycle going. It had let my husband and his coworker keep building the version of me they wanted everyone else to see. I called Rowan again that evening while my husband was in the garage. This time, I told her about Mrs. Doris Scott's visit and how it had made everything feel more real. Rowan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You don't have to decide everything tonight. But you also don't have to walk into that dinner unprepared." Her voice was steady. In a way, mine wasn't. She offered to meet me for coffee the next day so we could talk through what I might say if I decided to go. I told her I would think about it. That night, I lay in bed listening to my husband's breathing beside me and felt the distance between us like a physical thing. I kept coming back to the same question: how long had I been willing to be the person they described in that journal just to avoid conflict? The answer made me feel small and angry at the same time. I had loved him. I had built a life with him in this city, and somewhere along the way, I had let him and Troy decide that my voice was something they could manage and minimize. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and went back to the spare room. I took the journal out again and read the entry about the client dinner one more time. Then I opened my laptop and started a new document. I copied the journal entries word for word, added the date I found them, and added what Mrs. Doris Scott had told me. I didn't know what I was going to do with any of it yet. I only knew that writing it down made the shaking in my hands settle a little. It felt like the first small step toward not letting their version of me be the only one that existed. That afternoon, my husband came home early and said Troy was coming over to go over some last details for the dinner. I stayed in the kitchen while they sat at the dining table with their laptops open. I could hear pieces of their conversation through the doorway. Troy laughed at something and said, "She'll probably try to jump in with one of her spreadsheets again. We just have to keep redirecting back to the big picture." My husband didn't disagree. He just made a sound like he was agreeing without having to say the words out loud. I stood at the sink with my hands in the dishwater and felt something inside me go very still. They were sitting in my house planning how to handle me in front of clients, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The cycle I had helped keep alive by staying quiet was right there in the next room, comfortable and casual. I dried my hands, walked into the living room, and told them I needed to run an errand. Neither of them looked up for more than a second. My husband just said, "Okay, see you later," like I was already fading into the background of their plans. I drove around the block twice before I pulled over and called Rowan. My voice was steadier than I expected when I told her I was going to that dinner. I wasn't sure what I would say when I got there, but I knew I wasn't going to stay home and let them write the ending without me. Rowan didn't try to talk me out of it. She just asked what I needed from her. I told her I might need a place to stay for a night or two afterward, depending on how things went. She said her guest room was always open. When I got back to the house, Troy's car was gone. My husband was in the living room scrolling on his phone. He looked up and asked if everything was all right. I said it was fine. Then I went upstairs, closed the door to the spare room, and sat on the floor with the journal in my lap one more time. The pages felt heavier now. I wasn't just reading someone else's words anymore. I was reading the map of how I had let myself disappear piece by piece. I still didn't have a perfect plan. But for the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't going to keep choosing silence just because it was easier. The dinner was coming, and whether my husband and his coworker realized it yet or not, I was going to be there. The morning of the client dinner, I woke up before my alarm and lay in the dark, listening to the quiet of the house. My husband was still asleep beside me, one arm thrown over the blanket, like nothing had changed. I got up, showered, and put on the navy dress I usually saved for important meetings. My hands shook a little when I zipped it, but I kept moving. I had printed the key pages from the journal and tucked them into a folder with my notes. I had also written down exactly what Mrs. Doris Scott had told me. I didn't know how the night would end, but I knew I wasn't walking in empty-handed. When we arrived at the restaurant, Troy was already at the table with two of the clients. My husband greeted them warmly and pulled out a chair for me at the far end, away from the center, where the presentation materials were spread. "Heather's going to jump in with the numbers if we need them," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Troy nodded and added, "We've got the overview covered." Sometimes too many voices just confuse the big picture. The words landed exactly the way they had in the journal entries. I felt the familiar sting of being pushed to the edge, but this time I didn't smile and nod. I sat down, opened my folder, and waited. The dinner started with small talk about the project. My husband and Troy took turns steering the conversation toward their vision for the next phase. Every time I tried to add a detail about the budget or timeline, one of them gently redirected. "That's the kind of precision Heather brings to the back end," my husband said at one point, his voice smooth. "But for tonight, let's keep it high level." Troy laughed softly and said, "We all know how she can get when the spreadsheets come out. Better to let us handle the flow." A few of the clients chuckled politely. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my hands folded on the table and my voice even. When there was a short pause, I cleared my throat. "Actually, before we go any further, there's something I need to share with everyone here." The table went quiet. My husband's smile faltered for the first time. I opened the folder and slid the printed journal pages across the table so the clients could see them. These are entries my husband wrote a few years ago. They describe a plan he and Troy made to limit my role in client meetings and to make sure I stayed in a support position. They even discussed how to handle me if I pushed back. I kept my tone calm the way I had practiced with Rowan. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the words in the pages sit there. Troy's face went pale. My husband tried to laugh it off. "Heather, this is not the time. You're reading old private notes out of context. Everyone gets frustrated at work sometimes." His voice had that edge he used when he wanted me to back down. I looked at him and said, "The dates line up with meetings where you corrected me in front of clients. The language is specific. It's not frustration. It's a plan." One of the clients picked up a page and read it quietly. The silence stretched. Then my phone lit up with a call from my sister-in-law, Claire. My husband had looped her in earlier that week, telling her I was getting worked up over nothing and asking if she could join on speaker to help calm things down. He answered and put the call on speaker without asking me. Claire's voice came through clearly. "Dean, I've been listening. I saw the messages you sent me about Heather being difficult, but I've also seen how you and Troy talk about her. I believe what she's saying. This isn't the first time I've heard this pattern, and I'm not going to help you make her look small in front of these people." The table went completely still. My husband stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. Troy looked down at his plate. One of the clients cleared his throat and said they needed a moment to process. I didn't stay for the rest of the dinner. I gathered my folder, stood up, and told the clients I would send them my own summary of the project if they wanted it. Then I walked out into the cool Pittsburgh night. My husband followed me to the car, his face tight. "You just blew up everything," he said, his voice low and furious. "Troy and I were trying to protect the account. You made us look like liars in front of everyone." I looked at him and felt the last pieces of the version of me he had helped create fall away. "You and Troy wrote the plan yourselves," I said. I just stopped staying quiet about it. I drove to Rowan's apartment instead of going home. She opened the door without asking questions and let me sit on her couch while the shaking finally came. I told her everything that had happened at the table. She listened, handed me a blanket, and said, "You did the hard thing. That matters." The next morning, I went back to the row house while my husband was at work and packed 2 suitcases. I left the journal on the kitchen table with a note that said, I needed space to figure out what came next. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I just closed the door behind me and drove away. In the weeks that followed, the marriage ended quietly. My husband didn't fight the separation papers when they came. Troy stopped reaching out. The clients from that dinner sent me an email offering to work directly with me on a smaller project. I took it. It wasn't a big victory, but it was mine. My sister-in-law Claire called a few times. She said she was sorry she hadn't spoken up sooner and that she was stepping back from family gatherings for a while, too. The automatic invitations to holidays and weekend plans at the lake house stopped coming. My husband's family chose the version of the story that kept things comfortable for them. I didn't chase them. I stayed with Rowan for 2 months while I found a small apartment closer to the city. Mrs. Doris Scott waved at me when I came back to get the last of my things. She didn't ask questions, just said the neighborhood would miss seeing me around. I thanked her for the soup and for telling me what she had seen. Some days the quiet of my new place felt like loss. Other days it felt like room to breathe. I still think about the years I spent choosing silence because I thought it would keep the peace. It didn't. It only let the story they wanted to tell about me grow louder. Speaking up cost me the marriage and the easy version of family I had tried so hard to protect. But it also gave me back the truth of who I am and the right to decide what comes next. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace in your own life, I hope you know you're not alone in that choice, and you don't have to stay there forever. What would you have done if you found evidence like that about someone you loved?